Snowflakes drifted silently through the air, catching the faint light of a dying moon as they fell on the Ardennes forest. In the half-light of dawn, a young paratrooper of the 101st Airborne pressed deeper into the frozen mud of his foxhole. His breath came out in clouds, white against the steel-gray sky. The wool of his gloves had frozen stiff, and he could no longer feel the trigger beneath his finger. Somewhere in the distance, muffled by layers of snow, the thunder of German artillery began to roll like an ominous drumbeat. He pulled his scarf tighter, though it did little to keep out the biting wind that cut through the pine trees like a knife. Around him, other men shifted in their dugouts, rifles held across their knees, eyes scanning the mist for movement. They were hungry, frozen, exhausted, and yet there was no thought of retreat. The enemy was closing in, and the town behind them, Bastogne, was all that stood between the German armored divisions and the heart of the Allied front. The town itself was no great prize on a map of Europe. A small Belgian market town with narrow cobblestoned streets, a few churches, and clusters of stone houses, Bastogne would have been little more than a waypoint in peacetime. But in the winter of 1944, it became the crossroads of destiny. 7 roads converged here, arteries leading through the dense Ardennes forest. To the German High Command, it was the key to their surprise counteroffensive. To the men of the 101st, it was a fortress, whether they had the strength to defend it or not. The soldiers had been rushed in with almost no preparation. Many lacked winter clothing. Their supply lines, stretched thin across snow-choked roads, brought little more than ammunition and the most meager rations. The men dug foxholes as deep as frozen ground allowed, but frostbite spread faster than shrapnel. To light a fire meant drawing artillery. To move above the ridges meant being spotted by German patrols, and so the paratroopers endured in silence, their only warmth the closeness of comrades and the sheer determination to hold the line. Through the drifting snow, the town of Bastogne seemed to crouch against the storm, its buildings battered by shell fire. Inside its makeshift hospitals, medics worked without morphine, cutting away frozen boots from blackened feet. The local civilians, caught in the maelstrom, hid in cellars as bombs shook the earth around them. For many of these Belgian families, the arrival of American paratroopers had been salvation, but salvation had brought its own suffering. Bastogne, once a quiet town, had become the focal point of the largest battle fought on the Western Front. The Germans had struck with overwhelming force just days before, unleashing a surprise offensive across the Ardennes. Hundreds of thousands of troops surged forward, their armor breaking through thinly manned American lines. The offensive, carefully planned in secret, sought to split the Allied armies and recapture the initiative in the west. By seizing Bastogne and the vital roads that ran through it, the Germans aimed to cut off supplies and plunge deep toward Antwerp. For the German generals, Bastogne was not merely a town, it was a hinge point on which the entire operation rested. Yet what they encountered was something entirely unexpected. The 101st Airborne Division, veterans of Normandy and the ill-fated Market Garden operation, had been thrown into Bastogne at the last moment. Many of its men were scarcely recovered from earlier battles. Some were still missing equipment, and their ranks were thinned by casualties from months of relentless combat. But when ordered to hold the crossroads, they did not falter. As German artillery pounded their positions, as tanks rolled through the forests to encircle the town, the paratroopers dug in with a resolve that surprised even their own commanders. The siege closed in quickly. German infantry swarmed through the surrounding villages, cutting off every road. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely encircled. Snow continued to fall, blanketing destroyed vehicles and masking the bodies of the dead. From the air, the town resembled a small island in a sea of enemy forces, isolated yet unyielding. Inside, men rationed their ammunition with care. A single clip had to last through hours of fire. Machine gunners counted every belt. When rations ran short, soldiers scavenged through abandoned homes, splitting tins of canned food, chewing on frozen bread. The cold was as deadly as any bullet. Temperatures dropped below freezing day after day. Frostbite crippled hands and feet, and medics, already overwhelmed, could do little more than wrap bandages and whisper words of comfort. The men wore layers of mismatched clothing, scarves taken from civilians, gloves patched with strips of cloth, jackets stiff with ice. Fires were forbidden in the foxholes, and many soldiers huddled together at night to share warmth. In the silence of those nights, the forest creaked and groaned, and sometimes the faint sound of German voices drifted through the trees. The enemy was everywhere, but still the line held. Each dawn brought fresh barrages. German artillery pounded the outskirts, flattening barns, shattering stone walls, and setting homes ablaze. Civilians fled to the town's cathedral, seeking shelter beneath its ancient arches. There, priests prayed over the wounded, while shells whistled overhead. For the paratroopers, every explosion was a reminder that they were cut off, that no reinforcements were coming. Not yet. Still, they returned fire, their rifles cracking through the snow, their determination rising with each failed German assault. Bastogne's defense was not a matter of tactics alone. It was a test of spirit. Against all odds, the 101st Airborne endured in their frozen trenches, defying the enemy's overwhelming strength. Each man knew what was at stake. If Bastogne fell, the German advance would carve a dagger into the heart of the Allied lines. If it stood, the tide of the Battle of the Bulge might be turned, and so they endured the frozen dawns, the endless shelling, the gnawing hunger, and the relentless cold. In that crucible of winter, the legend of Bastogne was born, a legend that would echo long after the last shell had fallen. The siege was only beginning, but already it carried the weight of myth. German generals, confident of a swift victory, soon found themselves stunned. The crossroads of Bastogne had not yielded. It stood firm, a thorn in their advance, and within its battered streets and frozen foxholes, the 101st Airborne had resolved to hold, no matter the cost. In the cold autumn months of 1944, deep in the concrete corridors of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a different kind of storm was gathering. Outside, the German nation staggered beneath the weight of defeat. The Allies had broken out of Normandy in August, liberated Paris, and were driving eastward with relentless momentum. The Red Army, advancing from the east, had already crossed into Poland, threatening the very borders of the Reich. To many German generals, the war seemed to be sliding into its inevitable conclusion. But to Adolf Hitler, the architect of the empire now collapsing, surrender was unthinkable. In his mind, a single decisive stroke could still turn the tide. That vision took shape in the Ardennes, a thickly forested region stretching through Belgium and Luxembourg. On maps spread across the polished oak tables of the Führer's headquarters, Hitler's hand stabbed westward, tracing a bold offensive thrust. His plan was breathtaking in scope. Mass armored divisions would smash through the thinly held American lines, capture key crossings over the Meuse River, and drive all the way to Antwerp. By seizing the vital port, the Germans could sever the Allied armies, crippling their ability to supply themselves, and perhaps force Britain and America into negotiating a peace. To Hitler, this was not a gamble. It was destiny, a final chance to reassert control. To his generals, however, it was a desperate throw of the dice. The conference rooms of the German High Command echoed with debate. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the seasoned commander of the Western Front, knew the dangers. German forces were stretched thin, their fuel supplies critically low, and their ability to replace losses nearly non-existent. To him, any large-scale offensive risked squandering what little remained of Germany's strength. Yet Hitler brushed aside such concerns with volcanic anger. He insisted that the Allies were overconfident, that American soldiers lacked the will to fight in the cold forests, that British morale was brittle. What was needed, he claimed, was audacity, a blow so shocking that the enemy's coalition would shatter under the strain. Others around the table suggested smaller, more limited attacks, spoiling operations, withdrawals to stronger defensive lines, or strikes designed only to delay the Allies. But Hitler dismissed them all. Only a massive counteroffensive, a total solution, could achieve his political aim of breaking Allied unity. And so Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was born. The very name concealed its true purpose, making it sound like a defensive measure rather than an offensive thrust. Even within the labyrinth of the German command structure, secrecy was absolute. Behind barbed wire and blackout curtains, preparations began. Panzer divisions, the armored heart of the Wehrmacht, were quietly moved into staging areas beneath the cover of the Ardennes forest. More than 200,000 men were gathered, along with 1,000 tanks and assault guns, including the fearsome Tiger IIs, massive beasts of war, heavily armored and nearly invulnerable to most Allied guns at short range. These divisions included veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of attritional warfare, alongside fresh troops pulled from training depots and Volksgrenadier formations hastily raised to fill gaps. Many of them were boys barely out of school, or men long past their prime, now pressed into service for Hitler's final gamble. The logistical challenge was staggering. Germany's fuel reserves were critically low, and without oil, tanks were useless hulks of steel. To ensure the offensive could move, entire stockpiles were stripped from other sectors. Fuel that might have supplied aircraft or defensive units was funneled toward the Ardennes. Trucks moved by night to avoid Allied air reconnaissance, headlights blacked out, drivers navigating narrow forest tracks in silence. Orders were delivered by courier, not radio, to preserve secrecy. In villages near the front, civilians watched columns of tanks pass beneath the cover of trees, their engines rumbling low, their commanders urging them forward in whispers. The plan's audacity lay not only in its objectives, but in its choice of battlefield. The Ardennes had been the site of the German thrust in 1940, when armored spearheads had burst through seemingly impassable forests to encircle the French at Sedan. The Allies remembered that lesson, but by 1944, they considered the Ardennes a quiet sector. Its dense woods, steep hills, and poor roads made it ill-suited for large-scale armored operations. American forces assigned to the line were resting divisions, units recuperating after months of battle, and green troops just arriving in Europe. To Hitler, this was an invitation, a weak point in an otherwise strong wall. On the eve of the offensive, German generals visited their divisions, speaking to the troops gathered in frozen fields. They told them this was the blow that would win back the war, that they would split the Allies and march once more to the sea. Many soldiers, however, carried their doubts. Supplies were meager, boots thin, and weapons old. Frost clung to their coats as they huddled around small fires, listening to officers promise victory while the cold gnawed at their bones. Yet discipline held, and the orders were clear. Attack at dawn, smash through, and keep moving until Antwerp lay at their feet. In the Allied headquarters, complacency had taken root. Reports of German movements were dismissed as defensive maneuvers, the desperate shuffling of a collapsing enemy. American and British commanders believed the Ardennes front to be stable, a quiet sector where battle-weary units could rest before the final push into Germany. Intelligence officers underestimated the enemy's capacity, blinded by the assumption that Germany no longer possessed the strength for major operations. Thus, when the offensive began, it struck with the force of a hammer blow against an unguarded shield. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1944, the stillness of the Ardennes was broken by a thunderclap of artillery. More than 1,600 German guns roared in unison, lighting up the dark sky with fire. Shells screamed across the snow-laden forests, tearing through American positions, smashing communications, and sowing confusion. Infantry surged forward in waves, followed by tanks grinding along icy roads. American units, caught off guard and outnumbered, reeled under the assault. Entire companies were overrun, supply depots captured, and the front thrown into chaos. The German advance, though daring, was fraught with peril. Snowstorms grounded the Allied air forces, giving the attackers a temporary shield from devastating airstrikes. But the very weather that protected them also slowed their own movements. Tanks bogged down on icy hills, fuel shortages delayed spearheads, and traffic jams snarled miles of narrow forest roads. What Hitler envisioned as a lightning strike quickly became a desperate race against time. Each hour lost in the snow meant a stronger Allied response. Still, the initial shock was profound. German columns pushed westward, capturing villages and crossroads, sowing panic among rear echelon units. Rumors spread of disguised German commandos in American uniforms, infiltrating lines and turning road signs to mislead convoys. The sense of confusion was total. Yet at the heart of this chaos stood Bastogne, a small Belgian town that commanded the vital road network. German generals knew it must be taken swiftly if the advance was to succeed. American generals knew it must not fall, no matter the cost. As the panzers pressed forward, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Second World War. Hitler's gamble had been cast across the snowy forests of the Ardennes. For the Allies, the coming days would test not only their strategy, but their very endurance. And for the men of the 101st Airborne, rushing into Bastogne, it would mean standing against the storm at the very crossroads of history. The engines of the trucks roared against the frozen air, their headlights dimmed under blackout orders, cutting thin beams of light through the Ardennes night. Men of the 101st Airborne huddled in the open beds, clutching their rifles to their chests as icy wind whipped across their faces. Their breath froze into mist that trailed behind in the darkness, mingling with the exhaust fumes that lingered low over the convoy. Some tried to wrap themselves in blankets or scraps of canvas, but most had little more than their standard field jackets, thin cloth that offered no mercy against the bitter Belgian winter. As the convoy jolted over rutted roads, the men knew only this: they were heading into another fight, and perhaps the hardest one of all. These were the Screaming Eagles, veterans of Normandy's drop zones, and the disastrous push at Market Garden. Their ranks carried scars, missing comrades, old wounds, the exhaustion of battles fought without rest. In the weeks before the German counteroffensive, many of them had been back in camp, resting, refitting, hoping for a moment's reprieve from the unending grind of war. Instead, they now rode north, called on once again as firemen of the front. The division rushed wherever the line was in danger of collapse. That night, in the freezing dark of December 18, 1944, their destination was Bastogne, a name that meant little then, but would soon be written into legend. The journey itself was an ordeal. Snow fell in sheets, coating the canvas tops of the lead trucks and icing the roads beneath their tires. Convoys stretched for miles, crawling forward as military police directed traffic in near-total blackout conditions. Along the verges, burned-out vehicles smoldered from earlier German air attacks. Soldiers in the trucks dozed fitfully, rifles balanced across their laps, their helmets pulled low against the sting of the wind. Some whispered about rumors they had heard, about entire American units being overrun, about German tanks racing westward, about a counterattack so massive it threatened to split the entire Allied front. When they arrived near Bastogne, the men dismounted into chaos. Officers and non-commissioned leaders scrambled to deploy their understrength regiments. Maps were hastily spread across jeep hoods, flashlights covered with blankets to hide their glow from enemy planes. Units were positioned by guesswork as much as design. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, for example, held the southeast approaches, while the paratroopers of the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments were dispatched to the surrounding villages and ridgelines. The division was missing much of its heavy artillery, its tanks, and its supply trains. Yet their orders were unambiguous: hold Bastogne at all costs. For the men on the ground, reality struck quickly. Their winter gear had not yet caught up to them, and many went into foxholes with little more than a single blanket or overcoat. Food was scarce, K-rations barely enough to ward off hunger, let alone sustain men in combat. Weapons were dependable but limited. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, and the few artillery pieces already in place. Against them came news of German panzer divisions, massed armor and infantry, including the elite 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr, units hardened from years on the Eastern Front. The imbalance was staggering. The screaming eagles, lightly armed and shivering in the snow, would be tasked with halting a mechanized onslaught. Still, resolve stiffened. Many of these men had jumped into Normandy, facing fire from all sides. They had marched across Holland in Market Garden, fighting house to house. They were no strangers to impossible odds. At Bastogne, their task was different, not to seize ground, but to hold it. Every street, every farmhouse, every frozen field became a point of resistance. Engineers strung mines along roads. Machine gun crews dug nests along hedgerows. Mortar teams calculated ranges in the frozen soil. Bastogne, once an ordinary Belgian town, was transformed overnight into a fortress. Civilians watched anxiously as the Americans poured in. Families peered from cellars as long columns of soldiers marched through the streets, their breath steaming in the cold, their boots striking the cobblestones in unison. Children stared wide-eyed at paratroopers who seemed larger than life, their eagle patches catching the glow of lantern light. To the townspeople, the sudden arrival of the 101st brought a fragile hope. They knew the German armies were advancing rapidly. Many had seen the columns of refugees already fleeing west. The sight of the paratroopers digging in gave them courage, even as shells began to fall on the outskirts. Commanders worked with grim determination. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, serving as acting division commander, moved among his officers, urging them to spread their men wide and hold the key approaches. Communications lines buzzed with reports of German advances. Each crossroads, each hilltop, was a potential avenue of attack, and there were far too few men to cover them all. Yet in the mind of McAuliffe and his staff, there could be no withdrawal. Bastogne was the hinge of the Ardennes, and if it fell, the Germans would open the road to Antwerp. As night fell, the first probes came. German patrols skirmished with American pickets in the woods, exchanging fire beneath the snow-laden trees. The paratroopers fought from foxholes, their rifle barrels glowing faintly red from rapid fire. Ammunition was rationed carefully. Every bullet had to count. The Americans fell back only when forced, then regrouped and dug in again, each delay buying time for the defense to solidify. The men felt the weight of what was coming. They were not fools. They knew they faced one of the most powerful armored thrusts Germany could still muster. And yet, within their ranks, there was also defiance. Veterans reminded the younger soldiers that the Germans bled just like anyone else. If they could hold the crossroads, if they could delay the advance, then perhaps reinforcements would come. The sense of destiny grew heavy in the frozen night air. Bastogne was not just another assignment. It was the place where they would either hold the line or see the front collapse around them. By dawn, snow covered the foxholes like burial shrouds. Men shook frost from their helmets and prepared for another day, their rifles cradled in numb hands. Artillery thundered in the distance, echoing through the valleys. German armor was on the move. The screaming eagles, battered and underprepared, stood ready to fight. Their presence at the crossroads would soon turn Bastogne from a vulnerable town into a symbol of defiance. And as the first tanks rumbled into view, the paratroopers braced themselves, knowing that what they did in the coming days could decide not just the fate of Bastogne, but of the entire Allied front in Western Europe. Snow fell in heavy silence over Bastogne, blanketing the wreckage of shattered homes, burned-out trucks, and frozen fields littered with shell craters. In the dim light of December, the town looked more like a graveyard than a battlefield. The streets were slick with ice. The walls of buildings crumbled under the relentless pounding of artillery. and the air was thick with the acrid scent of cordite and smoke. In cellars beneath the rubble, Belgian civilians huddled together, children wrapped in rags, their eyes wide as the earth trembled from another German barrage. Above them, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne tightened their grips on rifles and machine guns, staring into the white void beyond the town's perimeter. They knew the enemy was out there, waiting, encircling them completely. Bastogne was an island surrounded by fire and steel. By December 21st, the encirclement was total. Every road leading in and out of Bastogne was sealed by German armor and infantry. The once open supply routes were cut off, leaving the paratroopers with only what they carried on their backs or could scrounge from wrecked convoys. Ammunition was precious. Each bullet counted. Each artillery shell rationed. Food dwindled to half rations, then quarter rations. Soldiers gnawed on frozen biscuits, shared what remained of canned meat, and boiled snow for water. Hunger gnawed at them as bitterly as the frost, but no one thought of surrender. The word itself was poison. The shelling was unrelenting. German artillery batteries ringed the town, pouring fire on crossroads, aid stations, and any sign of movement. Entire blocks were flattened in minutes. Medics dragged the wounded into basements converted into makeshift hospitals. There, under flickering lanterns, surgeons worked with hands numb from the cold, improvising when morphine and bandages ran out. Saw blades dulled from repeated amputations, and men screamed into cloth as shattered limbs were removed to save their lives. In one cellar, a Belgian priest moved between the wounded, offering last rites as dust drifted from the ceiling with every distant explosion. Yet, in the midst of devastation, there was defiance. Soldiers repaired their rifles by candlelight, cleaning the blackened bolts and wrapping tape around worn stocks. Machine gunners stitched belts of ammunition in the dark, counting each round as if it were gold. Men rotated in and out of foxholes, trading a few minutes near a fire for hours of exposure in the snow. Cigarettes were passed between hands, their smoke curling into the frozen air. These small acts of endurance became a lifeline, proof that they were still in the fight. The German assaults came in waves. Infantry advanced through the woods, their silhouettes dark against the snow, while tanks rumbled forward on icy roads, their turrets swinging like hunters seeking prey. Each time the paratroopers met them with stubborn fire. Bazooka teams darted from cover to strike armored columns, sending rockets streaking into steel hulls. Mortar crews unleashed their rounds until the tubes glowed faintly in the night. Riflemen fired from stone walls and frozen hedgerows, each shot measured, each target chosen with care. Again and again, the Germans probed the defenses, only to be thrown back with heavy losses. Inside the town, morale wavered under the pressure, but it never collapsed. On December 22nd, that resilience was tested in a moment that would echo through history. At noon, a small group of German envoys approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal letter demanding the surrender of Bastogne, promising complete destruction if resistance continued. The message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st. His staff braced themselves for a difficult decision. Supplies were nearly gone, the men were exhausted, and relief seemed impossibly far away. The Germans offered a way out. McAuliffe read the demand in silence, then shook his head in disbelief. He muttered a single word, "Nuts," and dismissed the envoys without hesitation. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible, a reply that carried no literal translation. To his men, it was a declaration of defiance as sharp as any bayonet. News of the one-word retort spread through the foxholes like wildfire. "Nuts!" became a rallying cry, shouted into the snow, carved into helmets, and whispered through the freezing nights. It was proof that surrender was not in their vocabulary. The days that followed were filled with desperation. Food stocks dwindled until soldiers shared the last crumbs of chocolate, splitting them with the civilians who had chosen to remain in the town. Ammunition belts were patched together with mismatched calibers, scavenged from the fallen, or pried from destroyed vehicles. Uniforms grew stiff with ice, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Men stuffed their boots with newspaper, wrapped hands in cloth, and endured hour after hour, day after day. Despite the deprivation, a fierce determination burned. Bastogne had become a fortress not of stone, but of willpower. The paratroopers held the crossroads with sheer defiance, forcing the Germans to bleed for every advance. German commanders were stunned that such a lightly armed division could resist so long against overwhelming firepower. Every delay at Bastogne disrupted their timetable. Every failed assault drained their strength. What had begun as a confident encirclement was turning into a costly stalemate. And so, Bastogne endured, battered by shells, frozen by winter, starved of supplies, but unbroken. The famous word, nuts, was more than just a reply to an ultimatum. It was a symbol, a statement carved into the fabric of the battle. Against the hunger, the cold, and the steel of the enemy, the screaming eagles stood their ground, proving that sometimes defiance itself can be the most powerful weapon of all. The siege was not yet lifted, the relief not yet in sight, but the paratroopers knew they had already made history. With each passing day, their defiance grew louder, echoing through the snowy forests. Bastogne had not fallen, and the Germans, who believed they had trapped their prey, now found themselves ensnared in a fight they could not finish. Snow and ice lashed against the windshields of jeeps and command cars as a convoy tore northward across the frozen plains of Luxembourg. At its head sat General George S. Patton, the commander of the U.S. Third Army, wrapped in his signature long sheepskin coat and steel helmet polished to a shine. The weather was brutal, the roads treacherous, but Patton's eyes burned with determination. Behind him stretched the thunder of engines, the roar of armored columns, and the grinding treads of Sherman tanks. In the depth of December 1944, Patton was attempting something nearly impossible: to wheel his entire army 90 degrees, pivoting them north in a breathtaking maneuver to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. Every minute mattered. Inside that encircled town, the men of the 101st Airborne clung to survival. The decision to move had been made days earlier, in a tense war council at Verdun. There, Patton stunned his peers and even his own staff when, without hesitation, he declared that his divisions could pivot and strike north within 48 hours. Eisenhower and Bradley had asked if such a maneuver was even possible in the middle of winter, when roads were choked with snow and supplies strained to the breaking point. Patton had no doubt. His staff had prepared contingency plans in advance, a testament to his foresight and restless energy. "We can attack with 3 divisions in 2 days," he promised. And unlike most bold pronouncements of war, this one would not remain on paper. The logistical effort was staggering. Entire divisions of infantry, artillery, and armor had to be pulled out of their positions facing the German frontier and redirected toward the Ardennes. Supply depots scrambled to push fuel, ammunition, and rations forward through clogged roads. Military police worked around the clock to control traffic, waving through endless convoys of half-tracks and Sherman tanks. Tank crews huddled in their vehicles to escape the biting cold. Their engines kept idling so that frozen oil would not seize the machinery. Alongside them trudged columns of infantry, their boots crunching on ice, rifles slung across their shoulders as they marched north to a battle they barely understood. Overhead, the weather showed no mercy. Snowstorms swept across the Ardennes, grounding much of the Allied air power that might otherwise have slowed the German advance. The Luftwaffe, sensing an opportunity, struck in harassing raids, their fighters and bombers diving low on convoys. American anti-aircraft guns lit up the sky, filling it with fiery tracers as men scattered for cover. The frozen roads became graveyards of burned-out trucks and overturned tanks, yet still the advance pressed forward. Patton demanded speed above all. "We've got to get those boys out of Bastogne," he reminded his staff constantly. and his army obeyed. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the screaming eagles endured their darkest hours. Frostbite gnawed at their limbs. Ammunition ran low. In cellars, medics prayed for morphine that never came, operating by candlelight while artillery thundered overhead. The men fought hunger with grit, tearing open ration tins with frozen fingers, sharing the last scraps of chocolate with Belgian children huddled in basements. Each day they expected relief that did not come. Each dawn brought another German barrage, another assault of infantry and tanks battering against their thin lines. They had no idea that help was already thundering toward them, pushed forward by the unrelenting will of George Patton. German generals who had begun the offensive with confidence now watched their timetable unravel. The encirclement of Bastogne was supposed to be swift, the crossroads taken quickly, the American defenders annihilated or captured. Instead, the 101st clung stubbornly to the town, and reports now spoke of a massive American army wheeling northward. Panzer divisions, already short on fuel and suffering losses, faced the terrifying prospect of being caught between the defenders of Bastogne and the hammer blow of Patton's relief force. Patton himself drove forward with his columns, stopping to check on units, urging commanders to push faster. He walked among his men in the snow, his voice rising above the wind, promising them that history would remember what they were about to do. Chaplains circulated among the soldiers, offering prayers before the march resumed. Every mile covered brought the Third Army closer to the ring around Bastogne, closer to breaking through and saving the paratroopers who had defied surrender. The fighting along the route was brutal. German rearguards fought with desperation, blowing bridges, mining roads, ambushing convoys. Engineers worked through the night to clear obstacles, building makeshift crossings over icy rivers while under fire. Tank battles erupted in the narrow valleys, Shermans dueling with Panthers in snow-dusted fields. Each engagement slowed the advance. Each skirmish bought the Germans time, but nothing could stop the inexorable push of Patton's army. On December 26th, after days of grinding combat and bitter cold, the lead elements of Patton's relief force approached the southern edge of Bastogne. Tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division rolled forward through smoke and snow, their engines roaring, their crews exhausted but determined. Ahead lay the German lines, dug in and waiting. The clash was fierce, shells bursting, machine guns rattling, men diving into frozen ditches for cover. But slowly, relentlessly, the American armor pushed through. At last, a Sherman tank broke the final line and rumbled into the outskirts of Bastogne. The moment was electric. Soldiers of the 101st, gaunt from hunger and blackened from days in the trenches, cheered as the first tanks arrived. Relief had come at last, not in time to spare them their suffering, but in time to save the town and the legend they had carved from the ice. Patton's gamble had succeeded. His daring maneuver, executed against impossible odds, had broken the encirclement. The German dream of splitting the Allied armies and seizing Antwerp lay in ruins. Their timetable had collapsed, their strength drained, their confidence shaken. Bastogne remained in American hands, its crossroads secure, its defenders unbroken. And at the heart of that victory was not only the grit of the screaming eagles, but the audacity of George S. Patton, who had refused to accept defeat, who had driven his army through storm and fire to shatter the enemy's grip. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. The relief of Bastogne became a symbol of American adaptability and determination, proof that even in the darkest winter, boldness and endurance could outlast overconfidence. For the men in the foxholes, it meant survival. For Patton, it meant triumph. And for Germany, it marked the beginning of the end of their last great gamble in the West. Snow still clung to the roofs of Bastogne in January 1945, when the thunder of battle finally receded into memory. The town was a ruin, its streets cratered, its homes gutted, and its church windows shattered by blast waves. Smoke still drifted lazily from collapsed chimneys, and the scent of charred timber hung heavy in the winter air. Yet within the wreckage, life began to stir again. Civilians emerged from cellars, blinking at the pale light of morning. American soldiers, gaunt and hollow-eyed from hunger and sleepless nights, leaned against their rifles with the posture of men who had endured too much. Bastogne had been saved, but at a terrible cost. For the German generals who had planned the Ardennes offensive, the outcome was nothing short of humiliating. They had believed that Bastogne would fall within days, that the lightly armed paratroopers could never withstand the combined might of panzers and artillery. Instead, they had been stunned by the sheer resilience of the 101st Airborne Division and the units that reinforced them. Reports filtered back to Hitler's headquarters of the failure to seize the crossroads, and the reaction was volcanic. His final gamble in the West, the last great offensive launched by the Wehrmacht, had collapsed under the weight of Allied endurance and adaptability. The dream of splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace was gone forever. In the weeks that followed, as the Allies counterattacked and pushed the Germans back across the Ardennes, Bastogne became more than a battle. It became a symbol. To the American press, it was proof of national toughness, of soldiers who endured frostbite, starvation, and overwhelming firepower, yet refused to yield an inch. Newspapers back home hailed the heroes of Bastogne, their defiance immortalized by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's single-word reply to the German surrender demand. Nuts! To the men who lived through it, that word was not bravado, but defiance distilled into its purest form, a refusal to be broken even when everything seemed lost. The battle also exposed the deeper truths of modern warfare. Bastogne highlighted the absolute importance of logistics. Without fuel, German tanks stalled in the snow. Without ammunition, American rifles would have fallen silent. The ability of Patton's Third Army to pivot north and bring supplies and firepower into the battle was as decisive as any rifle shot or artillery barrage. Leadership, too, proved critical. McAuliffe's calm steadiness in Bastogne, Eisenhower's trust in Patton's bold maneuver, and the discipline of non-commissioned officers holding together frost-bitten squads, all of these shaped the outcome. And perhaps above all, morale became the hidden weapon. Soldiers fighting on empty stomachs and bleeding feet drew strength from one another, from their commander's defiance, and from the knowledge that the fate of the front line depended on their endurance. The human cost was staggering. In and around Bastogne, thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or maimed. The civilian population suffered terribly as their homes were destroyed and their families caught in the crossfire. The Ardennes forests were littered with wrecked tanks, burned vehicles, and frozen bodies. Yet from that devastation emerged a legend that has endured for generations. Veterans of the 101st Airborne would recall the battle for the rest of their lives, their memories etched with the pain of hunger and cold, but also with pride. They had held Bastogne when holding seemed impossible, and in doing so they had altered the course of the war. For Germany, the consequences were dire. The Ardennes offensive had drained the last reserves of fuel, manpower, and materiel. Panzer divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were shattered in the snowy woods. The Luftwaffe, committed to support the attack, suffered irreplaceable losses. By January 1945, the German army in the West was broken, forced onto the defensive for the remainder of the war. Hitler's gamble had not only failed, it had hastened the collapse of the Reich. For the Allies, Bastogne became a lesson in unity. British, American, and Canadian forces worked together to close the breach, proving that despite frictions, their coalition held firm under pressure. The resilience of the 101st Airborne, supported by Patton's audacity and Eisenhower's steady hand, became an emblem of what Allied cooperation could achieve. The defense of Bastogne demonstrated that the war would not be won by numbers or machines alone, but by the determination of individuals willing to endure hardship for a greater cause. As the guns fell silent and spring approached, Bastogne stood as a scarred monument to courage. In the years after the war, veterans returned to walk its streets, now rebuilt but forever haunted by memory. They stood in the fields where foxholes once froze solid, visited the cellars where civilians prayed under bombardment, and looked out over the ridges where they had held the line. Monuments rose in their honor, inscribed with the names of units that had fought there, reminders that freedom had been bought at great cost. The legacy of Bastogne reaches beyond its snow-covered fields. It is a reminder that wars are decided not only by strategies drawn on maps or weapons forged in factories, but by the spirit of those who endure the unendurable. The men of the 101st Airborne, freezing and starving in the winter of 1944, proved that resolve could defy overwhelming odds and reshape the course of history. Their stand at Bastogne became a testament to courage in its rawest form. Ordinary men transformed into legends by extraordinary circumstances. In the end, Bastogne was not merely a battle for a crossroads. It was a battle for the future of Europe, for the survival of Allied unity, and for the principle that determination can triumph over despair. Out of the snow and fire of the Ardennes, a story was written that would echo across generations, that even when surrounded, even when battered and starved, the human spirit, armed with courage and conviction, can hold the line.